Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Crazy Money. I am your host, Paulollinger. I've got a great conversation to share with you today with my guests from Paris, Nick Kostov, and from Tokyo, Sean McLain. Nick and Sean are both reporters for the Wall Street Journal, and they are also co-authors of a new book called Boundless, The Rise and Fall and Escape of Carlos Ghosn. Well, who is Carlos Ghosn and why did he need to escape? I'm about to tell you that, so chill for a second. Here we go. Carlos Ghosn served simultaneously as the CEO of Nissan and chairman CEO of the French automaker Renault. After decades-long, accomplishment-rich rise up the corporate ranks, Carlos was arrested in Japan for allegedly now, paying himself tens of millions of dollars in unreported income, and he did some other financial shenanigans, allegedly, that weren't totally legal. Here's where the story gets nutty. He eventually fled Japan's harsh judicial system and returned to Lebanon by hiding in an amplifier case, like a big square case that you would see a roadie roll up on stage at a rock concert. And they smuggled that case into a private jet that flew surreptitiously, mind you, from Japan to Istanbul, and he eventually got to Lebanon. Now, since international arrest warrants are still outstanding for Carlos, he is likely to live out the rest of his life in Lebanon, which does not extradite its citizens. This story of a globe-trotting CEO who speaks like 4 or 5 languages, hiding in a box to get out of trouble is just bonkers. And the book, Boundless, by Nick and Sean, is a great read. You'll definitely want to hear this conversation, and you want to check out the book, links to which are in the show notes. In this conversation, we discuss Carlos's unique family life and why his father was arrested for murder. Family tradition. Carlos's life as a young executive in Greenville, South Carolina, because when you think globe-trotting CEO, you think Greenville, South Carolina. How and why Renault and Nissan got together in the first place. How and why Monsieur Ghosn found himself in the financial trouble that led to his downfall. The surprisingly brutal nature of the Japanese court system. This was an eye-opening thing I did not know about before I read the book. And lastly, and most incredibly, the details of his escape from Japan. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you're going to love this conversation with Nick Kostov and Sean McLain. Nick Kostov from Paris and Sean McLain from Tokyo, welcome to Crazy Money.
Thanks for having us.
Guys, you're the authors of a new book called Boundless, The Rise, Fall, and Escape of Carlos Ghosn, who was the CEO of both Renault and Nissan. Let's take his story in that order, the rise, fall, and escape. First of all, his childhood. Carlos comes from a very colorful family. What was his childhood like?
So, I mean, his childhood, first of all, he was born in Portobello, which is a tiny village in the depths of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. So, you know, his granddad and his dad were successful there, but it's a village which had, you know, no paved roads, which was difficult to access from the rest of Brazil. I mean, it's a tough life, the life in Portobello. So that's where he comes from.
Why were they there?
So they were there because his granddad was trying to get rich, basically, and he left Lebanon as a teenager. And some people went to, you know, California to pan for gold, and he went to the Amazon because at the time it was booming because of the rubber trade. And so there were, like, you know, cars being built, Fords, people were buying their first cars. And so there was a big need for tire and for rubber to make tires. And so people who went to the Amazon at the time were getting extremely rich. And so Bishara, who was Ghosn's granddad, saw this opportunity and went with his wife to Portobello. And so that's why the family was there. When Ghosn was young, he was frequently ill, which a doctor basically said it was because of the water wasn't clean in Portobello. And so as a young boy, he moves back to Lebanon with his mum. And then, you know, he attends, they're a very well-off family. His granddad did very well. And so he attends one of the best schools in Lebanon, certainly the most prestigious. But when he's just 6 years old, so a tragedy basically hits the family because his dad, it's a completely crazy story, but his dad is basically smuggling, like, you know, various things, diamonds and whatnot, across the border. And the guy who's doing this with him is a priest who's an old friend of his. And the priest does it under his cassock. And anyway, the two have a disagreement one day, and the disagreement ends with the priest being dead, with a bullet in his head and another in his side. And Carlos Ghosn's dad is convicted for the murder. of this priest. And so he gets arrested at the airport, and he gets put in jail in Beirut, and he gets eventually convicted. First of all, he gets sentenced to death for this murder, and then the sentence gets commuted to 15 years in prison on appeal, because they ruled that actually the killing was an accident. He was just trying to scare the priest. He wasn't trying to kill him. But anyway, this was obviously a hugely formative experience for a young Carlos, because at the age of 6, this was a huge story in Beirut, enormous story. Obviously, the killing of a priest. There was like religious tensions at the time, and it was on the front page of all the newspapers. And so, for a young man like Carlos Ghosn, obviously, something really tough to go through. And he then grows up without a father, essentially, who he visits in prison sometimes. But he's the man of the family. He's got 3 sisters. He's got his mum. He's got his grandma. And as I say, he goes to this, he is kind of protected in this cocoon of the school, which is Notre Dame de Jamour, which is extremely famous school in Lebanon, run by the Jesuit priests. And, he grows to become an extremely talented student, very, very good. From the age of about 14, 15, he's he's fighting for the top spots in every class, and extremely good at history, very good at maths. He's also got this rebellious side where he kind of like steals his mum's car and goes for joyrides around, Beirut neighborhoods and whatnot. But that was his childhood. So eventful childhood, I would say. Not boring, anyway.
What's that? Not boring at all. No. And I wonder what kind of
childhood, no.
what kind of an effect it has when your father's arrested for murder at age 6. Does he ever speak about this in any of his writings or interviews over the years?
I mean, if I could, Nick, he actually, it's amazing to the fact that this was not known for so long, given the high profile that he had for decades. But I think it's hard to tell as a result, like what impact his father's arrest had on him. But what is clear is that Carlos Ghosn always pointed to his grandfather's legacy as his motivation, right? That sort of entrepreneurial spirit of dropping everything and setting up shop in the middle of the Amazonian jungle to make his fortune. Like that's the foundation of the Ghosn legend, the Ghosn family legend, and what Ghosn always tried to live up to. I mean, his father rarely ever got a mention.
And he eventually goes to the same prep school that was attended by some very high-profile people, Charles de Gaulle, Christian Dior, people like that. What was his experience like in Paris?
Yeah, so he goes initially to a school called Stanislas, which, as you say, is very prestigious. His experience in Paris is that Paris is very cold compared to Beirut. Like Beirut is a kind of warm-blooded, friendly, and Parisians, I mean, I live here, but not the friendliest, like very nice once you get to know them, but tough nuts to crack often. And so, his experience is that Paris is cold, French people are distant, and also academically, Stanislas is an extremely good school. And so he goes from being kind of top of the class and everybody respects his intellect to actually failing classes. Which is an experience that a lot of people who go to these prep schools go through. They go from being top of their class to suddenly being, struggling. And he was getting, 4 out of 20 in maths, which is like a terrible grade, not even close to passing. And so that, initially very difficult in Paris, very difficult, but he sticks at it. He gets into probably one of the most prestigious kind of universities here, which you call the Grandes Écoles, which is Polytechnique. Started in the time of Napoleon Bonaparte. The first time he tries to get in, he fails, which is very common. Most people, the first time they fail. So he goes back for another year to the prep school, Stanislas, gets in on the second attempt, just. And actually, that's the hard thing. Once you're in at Polytechnique is there to basically make the masters of the French-speaking universe. Like there's, many kind of captains of industry have gone there, former presidents. It's kind of like the cream of the Ivy League here. It's really, really good. So once you're in, you're okay. You're on your way. And so that's what Ghosn did.
And many of the students and the graduates of this institution go on into the French civil service, and that is seen as sort of the prestigious route. But Carlos went another way. He went towards commerce. What drove him to that end, Sean?
Well, I mean, look, obviously it was in his blood. I mean, to a certain extent, like he didn't have a choice, right? He wasn't a French citizen. It's not like you can really join the civil service in the same way that a French citizen could. But I mean, he never really found the appeal of that route. I mean, Ghosn was always eager, in young adulthood, became eager to make his mark on the business world. He was out there to live up to his grandfather's legacy.
Yeah, one thing to add, I've actually asked him this question, and one of the things he says was ultimately he wanted to make more money. So he was pretty open that the French civil service was not the way you were going to make money in life.
So where does his career start?
So he starts at a French company, so I can take this question. But he starts at Michelin, which is a big tire maker, obviously well known, including in the US. And that kind of squares the circle, I guess, with his grandfather's legacy and the kind of going into the Amazon for during the rubber boom. And so he goes down to Clermont-Ferrand, which is a town in the middle of France, quite a long way away from Paris, actually, in around some mountains and whatnot, very quiet. And he begins to rise. Michelin is an interesting company because it's run along like very kind of paternalistic principles in that it runs the schools in the town, it runs the hospitals in the town. Like people tend to go and work for Michelin and then they stay there for their entire career. It owns the rugby team, and so and everybody is treated in a kind of equal manner. So at the beginning, even the kind of Polytechnique grads who are most likely at some point going to become the executives or going to run the company, they have to go and work on the factory floor. And so he's like, rolling up rubber, slicing rubber, dicing rubber, like making the tires, basically, which becomes very important later on because, many CEOs don't have that kind of hands-on experience in plants that Ghosn gets at this time. And so, he begins to rise. The other thing to say is that Michelin at the time is expanding really, really quickly across the world. And so it's short on managers. And so they're making these battlefield promotions. So if you're good, you rise very quickly. And so by the age of 27, Ghosn is already in charge of a plant. I can't remember how many people he's in charge of, but I think it's substantial. He's in charge of like hundreds and hundreds of people at a very young age who are older than him. And at a factory that makes like these massive earth mover tires, tractor tires. And so his career...
One of the youngest ever head of a factory.
Yeah, one of the youngest ever heads of a factory. And so his career just begins to take off from there. The guy in charge is François Michelin, who owns and runs the company. And he starts to hear about Ghosn. He kind of asked the CFO at the time, who was a former Lazard McKinsey guy, to take Ghosn under his wing, teach him how to become an executive. And so Ghosn gets put on these various crises. And he always does very well. He comes up with these solutions that maybe others don't because they see reasons not to do something, like culture, or like we don't usually do this, or in France we don't close factories, or Ghosn doesn't really care about this. He's very, very good at seeing black, white, what needs to be done, do this, and forget the reasons not to do it. And so he becomes known pretty quickly for turning kind of desperate situations around. And for me, like one of the key moves in his career is Michelin's basically expanded into Brazil in the late 70s, early 80s, and at the time there's like enormous hyperinflation in Brazil, like to the point where people aren't even changing the kind of prices on food products or whatnot. They've just got a kind of like color chart so that they don't have to keep changing it. I mean, I was talking to someone who was saying like he used to leave the hotel and when he'd come back to the minibar, the prices had changed again. And like the minibar prices were expensive. And so anyway, Michelin is losing all this money over there and thinking, what should we do? And François Michelin, in the end, sends a 31-year-old Carlos Ghosn to turn it around. So again, 31, he's put in charge of a country. And I think he's got about 10,000 workers under him at the time. And so again, very, very young, very, very precocious, turns it around.
And he pulls it off, right?
Yeah, he's tested every time.
And so we early in his career, we see at Michelin or at the end of his career at Michelin, at the end of his stay at Michelin, we see one of his personality traits, which is that he wants to be fully appreciated. He wants to be given the runway to go be the guy, as opposed to being the number 2 or number 3 person inside these older, more staid companies. Even though they're growing fast, there's tradition at Michelin, and he wants to break out. So what does he do then? Breakout being an optimal word that we'll hear again in the future.
Sean, you want to take this one?
Well, I mean, I can take this one. I mean, one thing that's important to note about Ghosn's time in the U.S., because after Brazil, he goes to head the U.S. operations, and because of the nature of the beast, he becomes almost the CEO of an entire company there, because it's just so big. It's also the first time where he really encounters American executive compensation, right? So they take over a U.S. tire maker, and he sees that they're all making way more than he is, and he's making basically middle manager pay at a U.S. company.
This is Uniroyal, right? That they took over?
Uniroyal, Goodrich, yeah. And the other thing that he becomes exposed to is the heads of American car companies, right? So he's mixing with, the likes of, Ioka and Bob Lutz, just sort of legends of the automotive industry from this time. And he kind of sees how they live and how they're paid. And I was talking to one guy who worked with them at the time, and he was saying that, Ghosn would remark, there's a feudal system to the automotive industry. The car makers are the lords, and we're the serfs here. And he really sort of felt that distance. And one thing that, Nick sort of remarked about is the sort of structure of Michelin is that it's a real family owned firm. And so Ghosn, by far, no matter who you ask, the most talented executive in the Michelin global, sort of organization, would normally have been a shoo-in for the top job, but he's got to stand aside for the scion of the Michelin family. And so there was a glass ceiling there for Carlos Ghosn. And it was just fortuitous that the head of Renault, the French car maker, needed a number 2 and came knocking.
Before we jump into Renault, how we got to Renault, I want to point out that he's living. Here's this Lebanese national who was born in Brazil, who went to a very prestigious French boarding school, is living in Greenville, South Carolina, which is 2 hours east of here. It is a very red state, and this is 40 years ago, right, or 45 years ago, when Greenville's a lovely little town now, a bigger mid-sized town, but back then it's kind of a small, very Christian, very provincial type of town. How does this guy blend in with the good old boys and the very American management at this company?
I mean, he doesn't. That's the point. I don't think Ghosn ever really blended in. I mean, even in Lebanon, he was born in Brazil, right? In France, he wasn't French. One of the few foreigners to attend those schools. And, I don't think Ghosn was ever in the inner circle of any society that he ever lived in. And Greenville, South Carolina is no exception. I mean, not only are they distinctively foreign in a city that probably didn't have a whole lot of sort of Middle Eastern population at the time, but he is the head of a major organization. His wife is driving around in a Mazda minivan while his friends are driving around in Porsches. He's just, it's a clear distinction. And I don't think Ghosn was ever really bothered by it. Obviously, he was motivated by achieving, sort of what everybody else, sort of above him had. But, I think to a certain extent, like Ghosn understood his position at Michelin was that he was not going to be paid as much as the big dogs, and certainly as much as the car makers. And so eventually, when he gets the opportunity to change that, he does.
I think one other thing to add here about Ghosn, which some people get the wrong idea about. Ghosn, I think, liked Greenville a lot because there are no distractions, right? He's a family guy at heart. He has his first kid, obviously, in Brazil, but then 3 more in Greenville. And these are very happy years for the Ghosn family, where he's either at work or he's at home, and he does spend a lot of time with his children, and they have an extremely good relationship with their dad. And I know that if you speak to him and also Rita, his wife at the time, they loved living in Greenville. Because Ghosn, even when he's at Renault, I mean, going and like rubbing shoulders with like the French establishment and like politicians and other CEOs and whatnot, that's not really his thing. He just wants to get in, get the work done, get out, and then enjoy the time with his family. So I think for him during those years, for what he was like, that suited him great.
So Renault comes knocking. What kind of a company? What is Renault all about at the time? What year is this, and what is the Renault corporate culture all about?
Good question.
Nick, you're probably best placed here.
Yeah, great question. So the year is 1997 when Renault comes knocking. Renault in France is an iconic company. Partly, well, first of all, you see Renaults absolutely everywhere. Like if I look outside of my street, there's a ton of Renaults on that street. So it's a bit like, I guess, GM, Ford, or whatever in the US. But also, it's got this amazing history where Louis Renault, who was the head of the company during the Second World War, got accused of like collaborating with the Nazis, then died in jail, and so the whole company was nationalized. And so for many, many years, it's the property of the state. And it's not a for-profit company. Doesn't matter. It's not even called a company, actually. It's called a régie, which is like a kind of special word to describe what Renault does. And what Renault does is essentially make cars for the working classes, right? So you need cheap vehicles, and you need the working classes to be able to afford them. And whether or not they make a profit is immaterial, right? And so this begins to change kind of in the 90s, where Ghosn's predecessor Louis Schweitzer comes in, and he starts to tackle some of the more unproductive factories, some of the kind of he does want Renault to become a normal company. He wants them to expand around the world. He wants to make a profit. I mean, the joke at the time in France was that you kind of paid for a car twice. You paid at the dealership and you paid in your income taxes. Schweitzer wants to put an end to this, and thus this is why he.
Did they make good cars? Did they? Was it a quality product?
I mean, I don't think it was a bad product for the French market. Yeah, they make good cars. The problem is they cost way too much to make, right? And so you're not turning a profit. And as I say, for many years that's fine as long as the state bankrolls you. But there comes a time when they decide to privatize it, and that's no longer fine. And so. Schweitzer is very good at what certain things. Like, for example, he's good strategically. He can think about which markets he wants to go into. He's very good at schmoozing in France with the political classes, the establishment, which is very important here. But he's not so good at cutting costs. And so that's where he gets Carlos Ghosn. That he knows that Ghosn by this stage is getting a burgeoning reputation as a highly impressive cost cutter. He's 42 years old. And so that's why Schweitzer decides to hire him. And they're an extremely weird couple. Schweitzer's this kind of tall guy who's like, I think his dad was an ambassador, and he's, very smooth. And Ghosn is this kind of short, obviously guy from Lebanon, hard charging, like fire and ice, completely different. But they make a great team, actually. And Ghosn does great work at Renault. I mean, if I can go into just something quickly that he starts to do at Renault. At the time, Schweitzer decided that to break even within a few years, they needed to cut costs by 3,000 francs per car. And Ghosn just comes in, tears this up and says, no, actually, we're going to do 8,000 francs. We're going to call it the 20 billion plan, and we're going to go way further than what you've been thinking you can do. And he's like, and I want to shut 3 plants. I would tell you to shut 3 plants. Big in France to shut 3 plants. In the end, Schweitzer shuts 1, and that earns Ghosn the nickname Le Cost Killer, because there's a huge...
And not even in France, right?
And not even in France, the plant's in Belgium. But still, there's a huge hoo-ha in the press. And so, Ghosn gets to work cutting costs at Renault.
play? How does it play? Do people see his value, or are they wary of him? And when does it become apparent that this is the guy?
I mean, I think people are wary of him in France because I think people are wary of executives in general, particularly foreign executives, and particularly executives who come in and just slash costs, which is essentially, that was Ghosn's job. Like, it was to come in and slash costs. So I think people at this stage are wary of him. The press, it's kind of like, it's his first time really being in the press, right? And so they're kind of having fun with this cost killer character. But very quickly, it kind of works. He delivers, or he and his lieutenant. So he starts to like promote kind of young managers throughout the company, give them more power, and they managed to deliver, and they managed to build this pile of cash. And Renault is actually financially very, very healthy for once, right? I mean, this is not a usual state of affairs. So it's like share price is going up, profits are going up. Everyone's pretty impressed.
So how does he become the boss? So where does the idea to pair up with Nissan come?
Well, I mean, look, you got to go back and remember that, like, this was a time of massive automotive consolidation. I mean, if anybody of a certain age remembers the big Daimler-Chrysler merger, right? And that kicked off a bunch of things. I mean, Ford was buying up foreign car companies, and everybody was going abroad looking for car companies to buy. Interestingly, there's a bit of automotive history that's worth noting, that Japanese car makers like Nissan made a big name for themselves, particularly in the US in like the 1970s during the huge gas price crisis there. But by the time we get to the late 90s, I mean, the roles have kind of reversed, where US car makers are strong again. And they're the ones with the deep pockets, and the Japanese car makers and Asian car makers in general are really struggling. So Schweitzer has a ton of cash. He's looking for acquisitions himself. He tried to go after Volvo unsuccessfully, and he's still got this cash burning a hole in his pockets. And they start looking at a host of Japanese car makers who, like I said, are now struggling after several decades of success. And they zero in on a couple of car makers, but Nissan being the sort of number one target, because it was, frankly speaking, a basket case. They had an incredible engineering. It was just the weirdest thing about Nissan at the time, is that they had some of the best, sort of engine and transmission engineers. And, sort of anybody who drove, a Nissan car would rave about its performance, because they were just frankly over-engineered. They pumped everything they had into sort of how these cars perform, but they looked like crap. They were just sort of like understyled, dated, and they weren't really selling the cars that at the time American car makers wanted to buy. It was just sort of, their priorities were upside down, and they dug themselves a massive $20 billion hole worth of debt, financed through some lax bank loans during what they called the bubble era in Japan, a period of rapid growth in the post-war era, which was rapidly drawing to a close, where they had a recession, and then the credit markets dried up, and suddenly Nissan found its sort of tap of easy credit drying up at the worst possible time. So they were desperate. And that's what they sort of zeroed in on, because Renault, under Schweitzer, as Nick talked about, was privatizing, but, in a time of increasing globalization, Renault was deeply aware of the fact that they were a European car maker, but really a French car maker, right? There was a limit to how far they could grow. And especially when Daimler Chrysler happened, you're suddenly surrounded by these automotive giants that have scale that you'll never achieve. And the fear was that these automotive giants would just eat up your market share, and that you would just be dried up.
So Nissan is a very proud Japanese company, and they have many suitors.
Yes.
And Renault isn't the most prestigious global auto brand, but that's who ends up being their lifeline. How do these two companies compare, and how does nationalism or national pride, I should say, play into to the success or lack thereof of a partnership in this case?
So Renault ends up winning the right to buy a roughly 1/3 stake in Nissan, almost by process of elimination. So Renault starts the negotiations to do a tie-up to buy a stake in Nissan, and pretty soon afterwards, Daimler Chrysler, who was incredibly aggressive in their expansion, not just stopping at Chrysler, also joined the bidding war, and Renault suddenly found itself as a very distant second place in that negotiation, where, Nissan, again, as I mentioned, very proud of their technical expertise, looked over at Daimler and said, well, yeah, we'd love to work with the Mercedes engineers. And nobody particularly wanted to work with Renault. Renault had cash, and that was about the only appeal in that situation. So it wasn't until Daimler dropped out of the negotiations and Renault was the last one standing at the altar that the deal went through. So
yeah.
That said,
so they have to be Renault has to be very diplomatic in the way they approach this. It's not an acquisition; it's a partnership. And when Ghosn comes in, as much as he was sort of people were suspicious of him when he came into France, it's even that much more when he goes to Nissan. But he runs the playbook again, slashes costs, raises cash, creates a more efficient operation, and is a hero at Nissan, right? So when do things?
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, the one thing to note about the Renault pitch is that they had Carlos Ghosn, and that was the one appealing thing about the pitch. And he does, as you said, come into Nissan, and he starts this cost-cutting exercise that he'd done at Michelin in the US and in Brazil, and same thing he did at Renault. The difference this time is he's working with Japanese colleagues at Nissan. And so he sets this ambitious target to wipe out the debt and to turn a profit in a couple of years, and promising to resign in a year if he doesn't get it done. And Nissan not only succeeds in hitting all those targets, but does it ahead of schedule. And Ghosn's always chalked this up to the fact that he told them they needed to do this, and he gave them a deadline, and they came back and said, actually, we can do it twice as fast as you think we can do it. So Carlos Ghosn's almost found the perfect colleagues for himself, where he's the captain and the quarterback and issuing orders, and he's just got a team around him who snaps their heels and jumps to attention and gets it done. They do whatever he says they should do, no questions asked, and faster than he had planned. So it's almost like a sort of a perfect marriage between Carlos Ghosn and Nissan, if not between Renault and Nissan, that he's found as sort of a core of colleagues that is willing to do whatever he thinks is the right thing to do.
In just a minute or two, how does he become the CEO of both of these companies that are half a globe away from each other?
I can tell this story. So,
Nick, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So essentially, Ghosn does, as Sean says, Ghosn does Trojan's work at Nissan, does incredibly well. Nissan is turned around super quickly, more quickly than anybody thinks. And the plan for Schweitzer was always to say, okay, we control Nissan. We have a controlling stake in the company. You run Nissan for a number of years whilst I finish up my CEO mandate at Renault. And then you come back to Renault and find someone else at Nissan, okay? Because Renault is the senior partner of this alliance. And so you should be running Renault. And this is the plan, as Schweitzer understands it. Now, Schweitzer's getting ready to retire in 2005. And in 2004, Ghosn says, well, actually, sorry, Nissan isn't ready. And the guy who I wanted to be my successor, actually, I don't trust him. So I want to stay at Nissan. You can stay at Renault. Schweitzer wants to get out. And so Ghosn says, well, if you want to leave, you can't leave Renault and make me leave Nissan. I'll run the two whilst I try and find someone else to run Nissan. And Schweitzer says, yes, okay, as long as this is a short-term arrangement. And so you have this short-term arrangement, quote unquote, where he's running two companies 10,000 kilometers or 6,000 miles apart. But obviously Schweitzer now says, when I interviewed him, look, I was an idiot. He never intended to give up Nissan. I believed him. I shouldn't have believed him. And Schweitzer believes, and he, usually knows what he's talking about, that actually Ghosn was making a far larger paycheck at Nissan, right? At the time, it was not disclosed. You didn't have to disclose executive compensation at Nissan. When it comes back to Renault, obviously this compensation has to be disclosed. He's making a French CEO salary. And so right now he's combining the two as head of both companies, which obviously is nice, but it's very difficult to give up that Nissan paycheck where he's probably getting like $20 million a year, roughly, and then take a French CEO paycheck where maybe he's getting 2 or 3 maximum $1 million a year. So Ghosn just combines the two and he gets a private jet and he basically divvies up his diary so that he's doing 2 weeks at Nissan, then 2 weeks at Renault, then 2 weeks at Nissan, and 2 weeks at Renault, which obviously is unheard of. Obviously, in hindsight, is completely impossible. But at the time, you thought, well, Carlos Ghosn, Superman, maybe he can do it.
This is not leaving work at 6 p.m. in Greenville, South Carolina, and being home for dinner.
No.
So it's all about the pay, right? It all comes down to the pay and Carlos's orientation towards his worth in the market. When do things get sticky for him? How do we get to the point where his pay becomes an issue?
Well, Japan passes a law around the time of the global financial crisis that is going to mandate the disclosure of individual executive compensation, board director compensation, over above $1 million. And of course, Ghosn is 20 times that amount. And he freaks out for a number of reasons. One, because he's always, since 2005, since he took over both jobs, been under a lot of pressure to disclose how much he makes at Nissan. And so he is worried for a number of reasons, but also within Nissan, he's worried that, he is making well above what is considered normal executive pay, even in Japan. He makes several times what even the Toyota CEO makes. And the Toyota CEO is like twice as, his company's like twice his size. So it's always going to be a hard conversation for Carlos Ghosn to have. So what he does.
But the board had approved this compensation package.
Yeah, of course.
So it's not like he up to this point, there's no games that have been played, really.
No games would be one sort of point of clarification. What the board had approved is a cap on the gross amount that all members of the board can make, right? So there is a pool of cash, and then they divested the responsibility for divvying up that cash to Carlos Ghosn. So Carlos Ghosn essentially had the power to set his own compensation and for all his colleagues on the board. And just reminder that in Japan at the time, board directors and senior executives at the company are the same thing. They didn't really have outside directors at that time. So Carlos Ghosn had the right to set his own pay. And Carlos Ghosn was the only one that knew how much anybody at that level was paid. So yes, the board had approved the compensation, but given Carlos Ghosn the right to determine that compensation. So yeah, there was an awareness of how much total was being paid, but not how much each individual person was made.
But in the midst of the financial crisis, the government mandates disclosure. And so this is where things get sticky.
Yeah. So Carlos Ghosn, his solution to this problem, after trying a number of things to try to delay the law, his solution is to quietly take a 50% pay cut. And of course, it's kind of the worst kept secret at the time for anybody who can do simple arithmetic, right? Where they disclose the previous year, the gross amount of compensation. And the next year, there's a big chunk missing from the gross compensation, and Carlos Ghosn's pay is disclosed. So Carlos Ghosn that year says, "Oh, I made it just under $10 million." And of course, is still the highest paid executive in Japan by a long shot, and gets a great deal of flack for that. But the problem is that Carlos Ghosn took a 50% pay cut, and Carlos Ghosn is not happy with having to take a 50% pay cut. It's not like his responsibilities had diminished or what he considered his worth to the company had ever changed. And one thing that Nick and I should note for you about Carlos Ghosn is that money for him he's not the sort of person that chases wealth because he wants to be wealthy. He chases wealth because it's an objective measure of one's worth and success, right? He refers to it as like the scorecard. He measures the performance of his colleagues and executives based on sort of empirical and objective measurements. And one of those things is compensation. You do well, you get paid more. So Carlos Ghosn got paid $10 million that year, and looking across the sort of the Pacific Ocean, it is counterparts in Detroit or elsewhere in the world, and he's like, well, I'm making like half of what they make, but I am 10 times the executive they are. This isn't right.
And at the same time, and complicating that is a bet that he had made based on the currency in which he is.
Yeah. So he'd taken a 50% pay cut, and in the financial crisis, what happened was that obviously, as we know now, credit markets dried up, and Carlos Ghosn had always wanted to be paid in dollars because all his expenses were in dollars. His kids were in college in the U.S. He had houses and properties and investments all around the world, and the yen is a highly volatile currency, like up and down all the time. And to sort of stabilize his earnings, he had bought into a sort of a currency swap agreement with a Japanese bank that sort of allowed it to stabilize how much he was earning in dollars. But the problem is, during the crisis, the yen went the wrong way, which meant that the bank was buying dollars at a loss. And at the same time, the value of his Nissan shares that he used as collaterals tanked by 80%. So suddenly the bank came calling for about $20 million in extra collateral to keep the position open, which Carlos Ghosn might have had available, but didn't have easy access to. And so he went scrambling for about $20 million worth of cash, which is what sort of gets him into trouble down the line. And the other thing to note about the 50% pay cut, just to sort of back up for 1 second, is that Carlos Ghosn never gave up on that idea of the fact that he made, sort of cut his pay by half, and starts working with a number of Nissan executives, including one named Greg Kelly, who got arrested alongside him, to figure out ways to sort of get paid that money back in secret.
And briefly, can you describe a couple of the schemes that he came up with to get him his money?
Yeah, there were a number of them that never really came to fruition, but an early one was to use what's called Renault Nissan BV, which was a Netherlands-based organization that sort of sits on top of the alliance as a sort of corporate structure for managing the alliance. Members of Renault and members of Nissan, including Carlos Ghosn, have a sort of seat in that company to discuss alliance issues. So the idea was to use this company to pay Ghosn a salary. And because it was what they call an unconsolidated subsidiary of Nissan under Japanese regulations, it wouldn't have had to be disclosed. But they ran into a number of issues, and none of these sort of plans ever came to fruition.
And he also had another a friend in Oman that was providing kickbacks for him from the dealership there, right?
So, Nick, do you want to sort of walk us through this one?
Yeah. So. So the first thing to say about the kickbacks is that obviously Ghosn denies this completely and says that it's not true. But this is now what prosecutors first of all, what in Japan he's charged for. So prosecutors in Japan obviously believe this happened, and France has recently issued an international arrest warrant for this. So prosecutors here also believe just a few months ago.
A few months ago, right?
And so what happens here is that. So if we go back to the swap agreement that Sean was talking about, Ghosn is scrambling around for $20 million to give to the bank as extra collateral. And one of the people he taps is a guy called Suhao Bawan. Suhao Bawan is an Omani billionaire, totally self-made, more or less illiterate, but started at the very bottom, built this huge business empire. And part of his business empire, part of what he did was to sell Renault and Nissan cars in Oman, but then also in other countries, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran for a while. So Suhao Bawan and Carlos Ghosn become friends. Suhao Bawan is the kind of personality that Ghosn really respects, comes from nothing, built huge wealth. And the two, obviously Suhao Bawan is hugely impressed with Ghosn, a rare kind of Arabic speaking CEO, huge celebrity in Japan. And so the two of them start a friendship. And at the time of Ghosn's kind of search for money, Suhao Bawan lends him $20 million. And they write a loan agreement to, signed by Carlos Ghosn and by his wife Rita. It's supposed to be a 2-year loan, although Ghosn has admitted to French law enforcement that he still hasn't paid back that loan. But anyway, he gets $20 million from Suhar Bawan, is able to take back the swap agreement. And this is how the financial relationship between the two start. And shortly thereafter, what starts to happen is that Ghosn, as CEO of Nissan and as CEO of Renault, he has a budget line called the CEO reserve. And if he wants to, send money around the empire for whatever reason quickly, and with just a few signatures, he uses this budget line called the CEO reserve. So if there's been let's say a hurricane or whatever, and you need to fix the office, you can use the CEO reserve budget line and send some money. And he starts to send, using the CEO reserve budget line from Renault and from Nissan, monies into the Omani dealership. And he sends roughly $50 million between 2012 and 2018. At the same time, between 2012 and 2018, $50 million, roughly, ends up going from two people, so Suhar Bawan and the general manager of this dealership, into entities controlled by Ghosn. And so what prosecutors believe is that the CEO reserve bonuses were in fact dodgy bonuses from Renault and Nissan, that there was no reason for them, and that Ghosn was getting them as kickback. And what he did with them was invest in startups and buy himself a yacht. So every good financial crime story has to have a yacht.
And if I could,
as one does.
every good story like this needs a yacht.
Sure.
If I could sort of interject for a second, and I think one sort of misconception Nick and I often run into when we talk to people about the Carlos Ghosn story is a lot of people, including Carlos Ghosn himself, focus on the criminality or alleged criminality of his actions, right? Whether or not it was a kickback, whether or not he stole money. And to Nick and I, it's almost beside the point, right? Because who knows? But and who knows what a judge or a jury would decide?
It's not beside the point, but I think there's a second point which you're about to make. I do think the criminality is also important.
Right. There's a okay, fine, fair enough. Yeah, the criminality obviously matters, but I think, at least personally, I think the bigger point is that Carlos Ghosn thought it was okay to take $20 million from a guy with whom he had a business relationship with, and essentially set up a second business with this guy in a personal capacity, and thought that was okay, right? There was sort of a lack of oversight and a lack of judgment, and it sort of just betrays a sort of thinking on Carlos Ghosn's part about his position within the company, that he would decide to do this and think it was okay. And I think that's probably the more telling aspect of this tale.
So when do things start to get dodgy for him with Japanese officials?
Well, things start to get dodgy with him with Japanese officials when people discover that he'd been doing this within Nissan. And this was right around the time where Carlos Ghosn is getting to the end of his career at Nissan, at least as CEO, and he's stepping back. He's in Japan a lot less. You know, the sort of the part-time roles of the dual CEO are skewing more and more towards Europe and less towards Japan. And that's probably there's a good rationale in his brain while he was doing this, but in Japan, how it's perceived as, well, he is less of our guy, and yet we're paying him all this cash. What's going on? And then what really sort of tips, the scale against Ghosn is when they start talking of, there's rumors flying about a merger between Renault and Nissan. And obviously that had always been in the background since the alliance was formed in 1999. But the promise at the beginning was that it's a different sort of automotive partnership. And Carlos Ghosn for years was very publicly and vehemently opposed to the idea of a merger, saying it doesn't work. How could I possibly join together a quintessentially Japanese and a quintessentially French organization? But suddenly his tune seems to change. He starts to talk about, shareholder desires and, the interests of all the different stakeholders. And we have to examine all the things on the table. And there starts to be, sort of unnamed sources in news articles around the world saying that a merger is being planned, and a merger was being planned. Ghosn was working actively with people at Renault and Nissan to plan a merger. And so a group of Nissan executives are motivated to start looking into rumors about Carlos Ghosn's improprieties out of a desire to stop the merger. And it starts with concerns about another Dutch-based entity owned by Nissan that had been set up as a investment fund for Silicon Valley. And they have something in Japan called a statutory auditor, which is a sort of quasi board member who reports to shareholders and whose job is to hold board members and senior executives to account. And he starts digging into this investment fund that nobody could get any information out of and hadn't made an investment. And what he finds is that the investment fund had been used to purchase homes for Carlos Ghosn's use in Lebanon and Brazil, where Nissan doesn't really have much of a presence. And not only that, these homes are worth several $1 million. And not only that, they don't really look like corporate housing. They look like personal homes for Carlos Ghosn. And what they find just kind of snowballs. The houses, they find the fact that Carlos Ghosn had taken the 50% pay cut and had been working on a number of ways to pay himself in secret. And they find just like a host of things, big and small. And what the statutory auditor does is something that had just huge consequences for Carlos Ghosn and Nissan in this whole story, where he unilaterally decides to take this to prosecutors instead of the board of directors. And once he does that, it kind of ties the hands of everybody involved. Once law enforcement gets involved, then they swear him to secrecy, and they just start the secret investigation on behalf of law enforcement within Nissan to sort of apprehend Carlos Ghosn.
So Japanese officials, and here's something I learned in this incredibly well-researched and enjoyable book, by the way, guys. I loved reading it. But I didn't know anything about the Japanese criminal system. And learning what I learned does not make me want to commit a crime in Japan.
It's a wise decision.
Tell me a little bit about how prosecutions work in Japan.
So it is an undeniably harsh system. Bail is rarely given before trial, and certainly rarely given in a contested case. So there is a lot of criticism of the system, and those who criticize it often refer to it as the hostage justice system. And certainly Ghosn had made that allegation. And the allegation is that they withhold bail unless you confess as a way to compel a confession. And there is something to that argument in that the conditions under which Ghosn was held for over 100 days was quite harsh. You're held in solitary confinement. The rules almost infantilize the inmate, in that you're made to sit in a certain position, like L-shaped on the floor, as an anti-suicide measure. So, guards can easily check in on you. But what it means is you've got to sit motionless all day, and you rarely leave your cell. You get like maybe a half an hour on the roof for exercise. And it's just a harsh system. And the interrogations were like 12 hours a day with no defense lawyers present.
Right, with no defense attorney present, and 99% of prosecution cases are guilty.
Correct.
That sounds suspiciously like a suspiciously good win-loss record.
It is very high, and certainly it is not hard to imagine how the harsh conditions there would encourage people to plead guilty in order to have it stop, because the penalties are often light compared to whatever the maximum penalties are. So, Greg Kelly who was arrested alongside Ghosn and went to trial, was facing 15 years in jail, and he got a suspended sentence in the end of it. So
Ghosn flies back into Tokyo, as I recall, right? And then prosecutors grab him and bring him into this harsh system, and he's kept away from his family, he's kept away from his work. What are his prospects at this point, and how does he even get to the point where he gets bail?
Well, he gets bail by hiring a fresh legal team who managed to work with prosecutors to come up with a set of conditions. I mean, in Japan, the other thing you don't have is it's not you can wear an ankle monitoring bracelet. It's almost like the honor system on bail, and it's part of the problem why prosecutors and judges don't want to give bail, because they don't have any real way to track your whereabouts. So Ghosn agrees, for example, to spend all day at his lawyer's office, and his lawyer to log all his phone calls and who visits him and things like that. But he eventually gets bailed that way. by agreeing to some harsh conditions. And in fact, on the second time he receives bail, he agrees never to speak to his wife, basically.
And just to pop in here as
Nick?
well, I think like one of the other reasons he did get jail was because as you made the point that we all kind of discovered the Japanese justice system through the Ghosn case, and after 108 days of being in jail, at the beginning, as you said, his family couldn't visit. We couldn't get to any representatives to Ghosn to even tell us if he contested the charges. Like it was like a big scoop when finally it came out that Ghosn had said that he felt he was innocent, and this was like days into the whole thing. So the guy just like fell off the face of the earth, and there is an international outcry at this stage. Like the UN has has kind of rebuked Japan, and Ghosn's wife is going on TV everywhere, kind of decrying the conditions. And I think in the end, the pressure does tell, and they give him bail. And actually, when they give him bail, I mean, this is neither here nor there, but it's one of the kind of funnier episodes of the Ghosn story when he leaves like dressed as a worker because he doesn't want like the press to follow him, and he gets into like this little kind of worker van. And obviously it doesn't work at all because you can really tell who he is. It's not the best disguise in the world. But anyway, like after 108 days he walks out, and I think that I really do think that this pressure in the end they kind of had to give him bail.
So his options at this point as a human being are to stand trial and roll those dice, or to try to do something heroic. And what he does boggles the imagination for the way CEOs conduct themselves, even in the craziest circumstances.
It is crazy. And the one thing one point of context to understand about where Carlos Ghosn was in a state of mind, right? Obviously, he was in this system that, Carlos Ghosn is the ultimate communicator, right? Carlos Ghosn always felt that like if any argument needs to be made, any sort of marketing for the companies he represented needed to be made, Carlos Ghosn was the best place because he could just communicate the message. And suddenly he's shut up. He can't say anything. And on top of that, he's facing these odds of over 99% conviction rates. And even more than that, the process takes forever. It took 3 years for the first verdict to come out on the whole, compensation cut thing, which was the easy part, right? And then you've got the Oman stuff coming out, which was going to happen afterwards. And then you've got Saudi stuff coming out. And so he was looking at like 10 years of a legal process as a 65-year-old man. And so Carlos Ghosn figured he might die in Japan, win, lose, or draw.
And even if he gets out of Japan, then there's France to deal with, right?
Yeah.
And then there's the United States. There's he's doing business in many different legal jurisdictions all over the planet. So he's got his prospects for living a leisurely old age are not looking good at this point.
They're not looking good. And for a normal human being that's not Carlos Ghosn, maybe you or I would sort of see this sort of thing, and we'd be powerless, right? We would have to accept that we have a 10-year legal fight ahead of us, and this is the rest of our life. Carlos Ghosn was never one to see the reasons why he can't live his life the way he wants to, and he would see, okay, what's the solution? And then this solution was to get out of Japan. And he does that by hiring a guy.
Just one very quick point of context, because obviously Ghosn goes from, look, I'm going to fight these charges and I'm going to win. And at the beginning, what he's arrested for, basically paperwork violation, is what Sean was talking about earlier, that he's kind of trying to figure out how do I make back this 50% pay cut that I took? Do I take, some kind of consultancy agreement after retirement to stay on? And so this is what, these are the charges, and it's frankly, looking from the outside, not that serious. Once the prosecutors get their hands on a hard drive, they actually find this hard drive. Lawyers working for Nissan pick up a hard drive in Beirut, which happens to have all of his late lawyers' emails and communications, and which kind of detail this alleged money flow from Renault and Nissan to Oman and into Ghosn's pocket. And at this stage, he gets arrested for a second time and charged on the Oman charges. And when he gets out on bail a second time, that's when he starts planning his escape almost straight away. And he never, at the beginning, he is answering the prosecutor's questions, right? On the kind of deferred compensation stuff. He's trying to explain what he was thinking, what he was doing. On the Oman stuff, he chooses to remain silent. He does not say anything. Even when a French judge went to Beirut, I guess it would have been 18 months ago now, a couple of years ago now, Ghosn had originally said he would answer questions, but does not answer the questions on Oman. Says that, the stuff on the hard drive was obtained illegally and that he doesn't want to talk about it. And so at this stage, he decides my best chance is to get out of Japan.
Yeah, and just to reiterate on the charges, like the first set of charges about the pay was an allegation that Carlos Ghosn had deferred a portion of his compensation that he hadn't received, right? So he's charged with understating compensation, about $80 million worth of compensation that he never received, that the allegation that he intended to receive it, right? So it's a weird sort of charge that really is only a crime in a place like Japan. But the stuff on Oman looks like theft. And that's where they find all this stuff on the hard drive. This is where we find out about the yacht, about the $20 million going into Carlos Ghosn's, $50 million going into Carlos Ghosn's pocket, and the investments into Silicon Valley. All of that stuff, like there's just like a host more smoke coming out of that pile.
Okay, so I'm in Tokyo. I'm out on bail. Do I just Google how to smuggle myself out of Japan? How do I get the A team to come to my rescue? You know, how does B.A. Baracus roll up in the van and smuggle me out of this society?
So I can take this one. I mean, so yeah, as you say, so Carlos Ghosn is desperate at this time. He's facing extremely long odds. On top of that, he's not allowed to speak to his wife. That's one of the bail conditions. So everybody in the Ghosn camp is completely desperate. And they're trying to think, okay, what can we do here? What can we do? And there is this guy called Michael Taylor. Michael Taylor is a former Green Beret. He has very strong links to Lebanon. He's married to a Lebanese woman. He served in Lebanon for the US Army. And Mike Taylor is actually known, for partly for rescues, right? So there was this New York Times reporter, for example, who was being held hostage by the Taliban, and Michael Taylor worked on that rescue. That's public information. He's also brought back a couple of kids who were American children who were abducted, taken to the Middle East and whatnot. And so one day at this dinner, there's one of kind of Ghosn and Carol's friends who says, "Wait, hang on a minute. Why didn't we think of Mike Taylor?" And so they kind of get in touch with Mike Taylor. They tell him about all of the tough conditions that Ghosn is under, that we've been talking about in a Japanese jail, the long odds, the fact he can't see his wife. And Mike Taylor feels strongly that Ghosn is being wronged. And so he begins to work on this escape. He meets with Carol, Ghosn's wife, several times in Beirut, and he starts to just work through it. I mean, there's like essentially two ways out of Japan, right? One's by sea, one's by air, and he starts to come up with a plan.
What does the plan look like? I mean,
yeah, what does the plan look like?
Yeah, please. Let's. The details are bananas. They are BANANS. As I think I might have misspelled bananas, but they're bananas.
Yeah. I mean, so there's a few plans that don't happen, which are also bananas. One of them is like getting him inside a cargo ship and getting him over to Thailand and then getting him on a plane. And so they're looking at that. They've kind of got him a Swedish passport, which actually I managed to look into. I found that Swedish passport is really shoddily done. But anyway, so they're looking around. They're trying to come up with an idea, and in the end, they decide that look, by air is the best way, because if you do the whole Thailand plan, you still have to get on a plane, you still have to cross a border. So let's just cross a border straight away. They look at commercial airlines, and actually, Mike Taylor has done some work in private, in kind of like various airports. He's done airport security in his time, and he knows that like private jet terminals, in general, the security is pretty lax, actually. For example, during the Ghosn escape, they have a questionnaire saying, would you like security basically on your plane? Would you like your bags to be checked? And they check no. I guess most people who fly private jet are not going to blow up their own plane. So, the risk isn't there. And so Mike Taylor starts to look around, and he's got this old friend, militiaman called George Zayek, who actually travels to Japan a couple of times to kind of scout out various locations. And together they settle on this pretty new kind of private jet terminal in an airport in Osaka. So they figure that the ones in Tokyo are too busy. They find this Osaka airport. And the plan is basically, okay, we are going to stick Ghosn in a music box. We're going to pose as musicians, and we're just going to wheel him past security, and we're going to put him on the private jet flight. We're going to get him to Turkey and then over to Lebanon, which doesn't extradite its citizens. And what I will say about that plan is that it's genius in its simplicity. It's so simple, right? And Taylor's pretty good at that, and they they don't overcomplicate it. They find a music box.
Like a big black
Exactly.
amplifier case that you would see a
Exactly.
roadie unpacking from a truck onto the backstage area for a rock band or something.
Exactly. And so they drill.
Exactly.
Yeah. So they basically drill 70 holes at the bottom.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to pick it up from there. So basically, they buy this roadie case in Beirut. They drill 70 holes in the bottom to make sure the gun can breathe. And then they fly over to Dubai with this case. And Michael Taylor feels that it's very important that they carry a musical instrument also to give an optic, so that when people see the cases, they think, musical equipment. It must be musical equipment in there, and they just leave it. And so in Dubai, they go into this music shop, and he asks for like the most expensive guitar case and the cheapest guitar. So the people in the shop are like relatively confused as to why the case costs more than the guitar. But as Michael Taylor says, there is method to his madness. And so he, buys this guitar, and they fly over to Japan, and they basically tell the airport workers, we're here as violinists. So obviously the one of the airport workers said in her police statement that she thought it was incredibly strange that violinists were carrying a guitar case. But anyway, nobody raises an alarm. And so they land, ready to pull off the operation.
So Carlos Ghosn, multi-decade-long CEO, multi-centimillionaire, suave, sophisticated, global multi-linguist, gets in a box, goes down an elevator in a hotel, and gets in a car and goes to a private airport.
Yeah, and there's so much about the story is just so great, and that Nick and I have turned up in details, and there's just this moment when they get through the hard part, like the nerve-wracking part of like getting it through airport security, making sure it's not scanned, getting it on the conveyor belt into the back of the Bombardier Global Express, and then the box gets stuck, within inches of getting into this airplane. And you have like Mike Taylor, again, remember the guy who's pretending to be a concert violinist,
the ex-Green Beret with the buzz cut, who looks like he's no Yo-Yo Ma.
He's no Yo-Yo Ma, and he's back in the plane with like 5 other like Japanese baggage handlers on the other side, instructing these guys, drill sergeant type, how to lift this box containing Ghosn like into the plane. It's just like you couldn't make this stuff up. It's just
So they fly to Dubai, right?
His other helper, George Zayek, is like deaf in one ear, like riddled with bullets, and kind of like walks with a limp just from all his kind of injuries on the battlefield. And so, the kind of concert violinist has to turn his head so that he can hear what people say. But to pick it up from what you said, so
only a high degree of polite credulity allowed this thing to pull off.
So they get him on. So they get him on the plane. They tell the pilots, leave the door closed. Don't come back here. Apparently, they're not allowed to use the bathroom between Tokyo and Dubai. And they let Carlos out and have a toast somewhere over Asia.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then land in Istanbul.
Oh, Istanbul, right. Istanbul, not Dubai.
Yeah, they land in Istanbul, and Carlos Ghosn is now a surprise extra passenger on this plane, and is escorted to a second plane where he then gets to Lebanon.
And Lebanon's important because he's a citizen, and they do not extradite their own citizens to any other to any other country. So no Japan, no France, no United States. So he is essentially lost in Lebanon in perpetuity.
Well, I'm just going to say one interesting thing about Carlos Ghosn is that he's always been a history buff, right? So Carlos Ghosn grew up on the stories of great men of history, and not sort of like your Ulysses or sort of Hercules stories, but Napoleon and Caesar and Alexander the Great. Those were his idols. And there's a great deal of irony that Carlos Ghosn has sort of ended his life resembling, one of his great idols, Napoleon, where he's basically stuck in a gilded exile in Lebanon for probably the rest of his life.
Nick, you had a cappuccino with him. Was that last year?
I think it was an espresso, actually, to be fair. But yeah, we.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I don't.
Yeah, we had an espresso. We had an espresso last year. Yeah, and just asking him about his new life.
What's he like? What's his state of mind?
Yeah, so his state of mind is, that the escape was for sure worth it. Like, obviously, he hasn't gone back to his old life, and what he would like to do is be able to fly to the US. He would like to be able to fly to France. He would like to resume his old life, teach at universities, and do what he used to do. At the same time, what he's doing now, I mean, he's living in a 17-18 million dollar mansion, which was bought for him by Nissan, and which in fact they're trying to evict him from, but so far have been unsuccessful. But I mean, his life in Lebanon is okay, right? It's not his old life, but it's not a Japanese jail. And so, he tells me that he's very happy. He's spending time with his wife. He loves to play bridge. He is helping out a local university where he runs a management course. And so, at least to me, he says that he's content, and that he's living out a comfortable retirement in his kind of ancestral homeland. The other thing which he's still very, very clear when you spend any time with him is that he's still incredibly bitter about everything that's happened, and he still feels very, very strongly that he is innocent, that he has been wronged, and that he wants to get this red notice rescinded. He feels like this was all a setup, a plot by vindictive Nissan individuals, and that the United Nations has or I guess Interpol has the power to rescind his red notice if they come to the conclusion that the red notice was put on him for political reasons. And I think the red notice for him is one thing, and he's particularly sad that he can't see, for example, his mum, who has a very, very close bond with, and who's in Brazil and who's very ill. But there's also a red notice from the Japanese on Carol Ghosn, his wife, who helped with the escape, and he's extremely bitter about that. And he would like her to be able to travel to the US to see her kids and to resume her old life. Obviously, she can't do that. And so, when you talk about this, like, seriously, his eyes narrow, and he's seriously angry about it still to this day. And he feels, or at least says, that he feels like he's done nothing wrong, and this is totally, totally unfair.
What's his tragic flaw?
I mean, like, it sounds cliched, but ultimately, like, there's something larger than life about Carlos Ghosn, obviously, but there's a point in Carlos Ghosn's life where he starts believing the legend and the PR about him, right? So Carlos Ghosn was the Superman CEO who could do no wrong and who could do the impossible, like running two companies simultaneously separated by half the globe. And what's come out through Nick and I's reporting on this book is that, there was a lot of hand waving and sort of theater around the Ghosn legend. But the problem is that, like, Ghosn lost sight of that, right? He sort of reached the upper echelons of the automotive industry and the corporate world and discovered, sort of this rarefied air of, like, zero oversight on him. Carlos Ghosn built huge amounts of credibility throughout his career by being, sort of level-headed and smart and serious-minded. And everybody started giving him the benefit of the doubt because he'd never been wrong in 30 plus years. And when he's at the top of Nissan and the top of the alliance, people just give him not less leeway, just increasing amounts of leeway and increasing amounts of the benefit of the doubt until people turn against him. And then they suddenly found that in the absence of oversight, Carlos Ghosn had done a bunch of very questionable things that lead to his downfall. And the problem with Carlos Ghosn is he kind of believed that it was his right to not be questioned. It was his right to have his way. And, if he thought something was right, and the whole world was telling him that he shouldn't do it, then Carlos Ghosn was probably right. And he had been right in the past. It's just, there's this sort of hubris and pride that ultimately sort of clouds his decision-making.
Can I also, like, add one thing to, I agree with Sean. I think one thing that's always really struck me about Carlos Ghosn is, I think obviously, as it's clear from everything we've said, guy with enormous qualities, but also some big flaws. And one of them was this constant need for recognition. His compensation is one, but there were others, like even to the extent that he kept every news article, even short news articles, few paragraphs, written about him. And he has these in a box in his house, and he would never forget them. And he would hold grudges, and he would read everything. And he just had this need for recognition. And I think obviously it's interesting to understand it. You have to go back to the beginning of the story and what we were talking about at the start with the granddad and the father, and being a kind of Lebanese national in these French companies. And I think that's probably where it comes from. But I think that in the end was extremely damaging.
The book is called Boundless by my guests today, Nick Kostov and Sean McLain, both of the Wall Street Journal. Guys, we'll put links to the book in the show notes as well to your Twitter feeds. I greatly enjoyed the book. Sorry, I'm going to do that over. Apologies. The book is called Boundless, The Rise, Fall, and Escape of Carlos Ghosn by my guests today, Nick Kostov and Sean McLain, both of the Wall Street Journal. Guys, I really enjoyed the book, and I appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me.
Anytime.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Hey, everybody, if you like what we're up to here at Crazy Money, do us and yourself a favor by following the show on your favorite podcast app and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Also, click the link in the show notes to subscribe to my new Substack, where you'll get bi-weekly thoughts on the role of money in our world and in our lives directly to your email inbox. Thanks for sticking around. We will see you next week.